Hello and welcome to Woke Watch, an ongoing series of videos where we examine the wokest stories I find on the internet. And it should come as no surprise that the cringiest thing I've read this week comes from the world of academia. Yes, another university has decided that something may be too triggering, too emotionally damaging for some of its more delicate students. And it's the University of East Anglia, the UEA, in my home city of Norwich. And the scholars there have decided to put trigger warnings on all text relating to one subject, a historical figure. In particular, a poem written about said figure in the 15th century. So thank the Lord it's only taken around 600 years for someone to get offended by it. The figure in question is the patron saint of Germany, England, and those who suffer with the sexually transmitted disease syphilis. Of course, it's St. George. Now, what we sort of know about him historically is he was born in Turkey. He probably served with the Roman army. And in 303 AD, he was tortured to death for refusing to recant his Christianity. And passages about his death are very unpleasant. But anyone with the slightest awareness about Christianity, because St. George is a Christian martyr, well, even the main man, the guy it was named after, he died with the crown of thorns, a badge oak over his head, and all that nailed to a cross business. However, the main focus of the trigger warnings isn't about St. George, the Christian martyr. It's about the story of St. George and the dragon. Now, that story was originally attached to St. Theodore, and it was transferred over to George in the 11th century. But before we get to the dragon, I'd say anyone who doesn't know that medieval Europe was a bit fucking rough, I would question how they got into university. It's also worth mentioning that the 15th century poem written by the monk John Lydgate is unlikely to reflect modern values and standards. So, spoiler alert, the dragon dies, and that's what the university staff are worried about. They think the dragon's death may traumatise their students. So depending on which version of the story you've read, either the dragon was living in a lake and poisoning the water system, or flying over villages and setting fire to the thatch. So the townspeople, to appease the great beast, first of all gave it their livestock, and when that ran out, they would give it their children to eat by means of a lottery. So I think we can agree, whatever happens to the dragon, it had it fucking coming. But the woke uni staff are fearful that the way in which the dragon is treated, in as much as it's feared by the locals and then has violence meted out upon it, is akin to racism. Is being a dragon a race? When can you get racism against a mythical fucking creature? And either way, even if it was a form of racism, if someone turns up at your village and starts eating the kids, action has to be taken. The next issue with the story of St. George and the Dragon is that action is only taken when the life of a princess is at risk. Because the scholars say this highlights the class divide and implies that working class people aren't important. Again, when that story was written, no they weren't. Peasants didn't count for shit. The idea that we shouldn't judge each other based on social class is a very new one. Still, there's more problematic content. Toxic masculinity. Why does the woman have to be rescued by the man? Well, in this poem that's around 600 years old, based on a story that's around 1,000 years old, it's unlikely there'd be much in the way of equality or modern feminism. In history, women were objects. They were property owned by their husbands. Women in the UK didn't get the right to vote until 1918. Once again, this is stupid woke bastards trying to find things to be offended by from history. On to the main event, St. George versus the dragon. George made the sign of the cross and charged at the dragon upon his horse. His lance pierced the beast, injuring it. George got the princess to lead the beast back to the town where the townsfolk were afraid. But St. George said he would kill the dragon if all the people of the town would convert to Christianity, which they did. So, if there are seriously students who can't handle the idea of a creature that doesn't exist being killed at an event that didn't take place, and even if it did, it was a millennia ago, if that's too much, Seriously, lock yourselves in your designated safe spaces and never emerge. You will not function in the real world. And all woke fuckery aside, what the UEA haven't done is actually address the meaning of the story of George and the Dragon. It's a story about religious domination and persecution. Because although we know Christians in the past have been persecuted, over the years they've done quite a lot of persecuting themselves. And the story of George and the Dragon is about Christianity becoming the dominant religion in Europe. The dragon represents not only the gods of the old religions, but the religions themselves, Wiccans, pagans, druids, those types of folk, because the townspeople are offering it blood sacrifices. And it stops when the princess, who's a virgin, is going to be sacrificed, because, well, one particular virgin features quite heavily in the New Testament. So here's the dragon representing all the evil old religion. Christian George sees it and gives it a good twatting. And you can still see remnants of the story in 2022 here in the UK, because the English flag is the cross of St. George, the cross of St. George. Whereas the last remnants of the old religions were over in Wales, about an hour from here. And some English people, myself included, occasionally call the Welsh Druids. It's unfair, it's implying that they're a bit backward. And of course, they aren't all a bit backward. But the Welsh flag is a dragon. I don't know, maybe the story needs updating for the 21st century. Maybe it should be St. Georgina, a gender non-binary pansexual person of colour who rides a dragon, rides it with the dragon's approval and consent, and together they can hunt down the most hated, the most vile creature of the 21st century. Straight white men. As ever, thanks for watching.